the role of the assessor, and in particular, we're going to look at the Early Years Educator Occupational Specialism Assignment 2 Part 1, that's looking at the documentation from the Department for Education, the Early Years Educator Criteria. We'll also just have a short overview of the requirements of Assignment 2, Part 2. Those are the structured observations that take place within the second year of your student's journey. But the focus is going to be on Assignment 2, Part 1. And we're looking at that criteria that was introduced in September 2024, so implemented with first years from September 24. So this is the document that NCFE have produced. And you will find this on the website, but also you'll be able to use this link on the slides here to be able to remind you of it. And I'm referring to version 5. So this is the Early Years Educator Assignment 2 Part 1. What does the documentation share with us? Well, the way that the contents have been arranged begins with those templates. We've got templates here that we're going to take a look at. The initial observation planning form, and that's really important when you're planning what you're going to see as an assessor with the student. And I'm hoping that this recorded session can be shared with students and with assessors as well as tutors, just to give that fuller picture of expectation. There are templates for activity plans, observation, the actual observation where you will write your narrative, professional discussion forms, future planning and feedback. And then, of course, being able to evidence where things are found and that final assessment judgment form. So we're going to take a look at the templates and we'll take a look at those together. And then I just want to discuss really how we've arranged the EYE criteria. So when this was introduced in September 2024 to be implemented as part of the Early Years Educator full and relevant criteria, then what we decided to do at NCFE is to categorise some of these. So we've done so with the following thematic areas. So we have child development, and the criteria associated with child development has been placed there. So stages and sequences, factors impacting child development, communication and language. The next thematic area being curriculum and learning. And under that heading, we have assessment, evidence-based theory, early years foundation stage, meeting the individual needs of babies and children, and pedagogical approaches. The next heading is looking at special educational needs and disability. Included in that, we've placed criteria, code of practice, and supporting babies and children with SEND. Next heading, safeguarding and welfare, where you can see that section 3 of the EYFS has really been contained under this heading. We have well-being, maintaining a safe environment, child health, child protection, hygienic environments, food and drink requirements, and personal care routines. Health and safety is making up the next section with legislation and guidance and policy and procedures, followed by equality and inclusion with anti-discriminatory practice, roles and responsibilities within anti-discriminatory practice in context and legislation. And then finally, professional practice and partnership working under the heading of those generic roles and responsibilities of the early years educator. Now, we absolutely appreciate that planning for those initial observations might be something that's generic to all students in the beginning, and then they become very student-centred even after the first holistic observation, don't they? Where some students will achieve certain criteria, others need to have that taken forward to the next observation, and then other more random criteria, if you like, may be seen by certain students at that observation. So it does become very student centric as you move forward. But we just thought that it would be useful to categorize some of that criteria so that you can see where things might go together, and that might help when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to plan with the students around child development, or I'm going to plan around equality, and you've got a starting point as to the criteria that might well be seen and more naturally occurring for those particular thematic areas. We'll take a look at the criteria a little bit more in terms of the intentions of the DFE, because some of that criteria is knowledge-based in the context of practical application, and other criteria is very concerned with practical application and demonstration. So we'll take a look at how that's been arranged as well, because that could further impact your approach to planning with your students. So this table here just gives a little definition and a little explanation of the different templates that we have. But let's just have a look together at what those templates look like and how they can be used with your students. So here we've got an initial observation planning form. So this is where, as a student, you would complete this, you would work with your assessor to identify the criteria that the assessor would like to see. So as an assessor, you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to look at this. It might be a result of an observation where you think, okay, I'll come and see that again. So you're using this in a cyclic process. So the assessor with the student is looking here at the expected criteria, and then the student is thinking about, what could I do to try and show that I can demonstrate that criteria within opportunities, experiences and activities with the babies and children that I might be working with. This is also something then, when those plans have been made, that can be shared with the placement mentor as well, to involve them in the process and to give any support to the student as well along their journey. And that's something that's usually very well received in placement, and that involvement and part of the training opportunities is really well received. Now, there's an activity plan here, and this has been taken directly from the Employer Set Project activity plan resources. So it's something that would, again, instill that familiarity moving forward, because don't forget, assignment 2 part 1 should start in terms of gathering those competencies as soon as the student is settled in placement. They've had their DBS, they've had some form of induction, and they've settled. And so now it seems appropriate to start with the competency-based observations, and that's absolutely fine. In contrast, assignment 2 part 2, those 3 structured observations that are assigned to the second year, they are literally allocated time within that student's journey in the second year. Assignment 2 part 1 is something that is going on throughout that first year as well. So in this particular template, you'll see that it says the child's name, because in the ESP, the students, as a student, you'll be given a sort of a fictitious name, if you like, a scenario. So on this activity plan, we would expect a child identifier such as child A or children aged between, so you're giving some kind of brief overview and outline rather than the child's actual name. The aims of the activity, links to the curriculum, links to educational theory, appropriate resources, support strategy, looking at your role and how you're going to use observation or could use observation during the activity, hazards, risks and controls, intended outcomes. So as I say, this is a template for an activity plan, may or may not be appropriate for the criteria chosen, and you may have other templates that you could use for activity planning, and that's absolutely fine. We're talking about a process here, but bearing in mind that if we're using this template, we are instilling that familiarity in terms of the Employer Set project, but use as appropriate. The student, you'll sign and date that. The assessor, you would sign and date that also. And then that's something that can be shared with your placement mentor as well, just to make sure that that's going to be okay, and that actually, you know, oh, this group of children or this particular child would really benefit from that, and have you thought about this? So that learning journey becomes more of a triangulated process, which is great. We then have the observation of skills recording form. So this is where you will do the actual observation. So as a student, this is the template that your assessor will use. And as an assessor, you can get this in Word version and and expand this so that when you're writing your narrative and you're placing the criteria here, you'll be able to make those matches there. So that's something that can be printed out and expanded in advance. There'll then be the student name and signature, and also the assessor name and signature. Now we know that from that plan, from that initial plan, some of this criteria is going to be met. Some of it won't, because planning with babies and children never really, very rare, goes completely to plan. So there may be things that don't get met, and they can be used for future planning, for feeding forward. And there might be criteria that wasn't even thought of because of a situation that a spontaneous situation that occurred within that observation time. And that's absolutely fine. You can achieve criteria that hasn't been planned for, and this will all be down to the assessor's judgment. Now, following on from your observation, as a student, you may be invited to take part in a professional discussion. And this is the sort of template that your assessor will use. So assessors will be using this professional discussion form. Now, all of the criteria can be complemented from the September 2024 with a professional discussion. So having these forms to hand is great. However, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that criteria has been arranged in terms of knowing about something in context and applying something in context. And that will give you an understanding as an assessor as to where to begin in terms of what should I plan to observe and what can I think about planning with my students in order to have that professional discussion. So just bear that in mind. Professional discussions for assignment 2 part 1 can take place in the early years setting following an observation if there's space and it's practical to do so, or they can take place in the back in the classroom. So any professional discussions that are going to be using an audio recording mustn't really take place in that early years setting due to the obvious risk of confidentiality. Audio recordings of professional discussions are used quite frequently, but please remember the importance of confidentiality and the importance of time stamping. In the classroom environment, back in the classroom environment, that of course may be more appropriate. So those are the professional discussion forms. We then have future planning forms. So I know that there are things that you might feel as an assessor are open to duplication. So the future planning form, the final assessment justification, and that sort of giving the student feedback are all based on what you've seen or heard in the observation and the subsequent professional discussion. So I would suggest when we get looking at the criteria and we look at an example of meeting that assessment justification, that you start with that. As an assessor, you justify why those competencies in your professional judgment are sound, that they have been met. You then look at the criteria that has been planned for that wasn't met. And you might want to give some justifications for the decision that you've reached. So this will then inform your future planning and your feeding forward and the feedback that you give to the student, so that you are avoiding rethinking, at any rate, the information that you're giving, and you're maybe compiling something that can actually do the job of assessment justification, which must be achieved, the future, the feeding forward and the planning, which is based on that justification and what comes next, and your feedback to the student, which is a sort of conclusion of both of those things. So seeing those things like that hopefully will avoid duplication. At NCFE, we are absolutely committed to making this process as cyclic and as efficient as possible for you as an assessor, and as straightforward and easier to understand that cyclic process for the student. So there's the feedback form, which will be sort of feeding forward to help with any future planning. Now, there's also a student evidence mapping form here, and this contains all of the criteria in a list as it's shown by the Department for Education, the DFE, and these are all of the EYE criteria. Now, what I did say is that the way that these are presented will have an impact, or may have an impact, on what you see and what you talk about in a professional discussion. For example, some of these statements that don't have a letter at the side of them, and I'll show you one with a letter at the side of them for contrast in a moment, but these are based on knowledge. So the student will understand that all children and young people are entitled to an appropriate education, one that is appropriate to their needs, promotes high standards and the fulfilment of potential, as set out in the Equality Act 2010. So that's obviously something that you might see observed in terms of, you know, adapting to the individual needs and stages and spontaneous events within an observation. And of course, that can be hinted at, but it might well be something that is then backed up by that professional discussion, so that the student can think about and showcase their understanding of the importance in relation of equality in relation to that Equality Act 2010. And that's where you would have a professional discussion. So you're having that discussion in context to something that you've seen applied in terms of that core meaning of equality, with this example in mind, but you're giving the student the opportunity to share their knowledge of the Equality Act as well. And that's something that can be planned for. Now, what we definitely want to avoid is the student using professional discussions to read through a script. We don't want that. But that basic understanding, maybe having a few key words to be able to showcase their knowledge, is absolutely sufficient and appropriate. So you'll see that there are quite a lot there that begin just with a number. So I'm going to go down to find one that may have a letter attached. So here we go. So here we have 1AA. So we now start to see some letters here. And that means that the Department for Education are looking for these aspects to be implemented when working with children. So these should be naturally occurring, some of them. Others you might need to plan for a little bit more, and others you may need to complement with a professional discussion, because the scope of the students' sort of interaction with babies and children is limited in a particular area. That might be related to SEND, it might be related to working with parents and carers, it might be related to working with a particular age group, for example. And so you're going to back up some of these competencies with a professional discussion. Absolutely appropriate and the right thing to do, absolutely acceptable. And in the knowledge statements, I guess you could say that it's the other way around. You might sort of plan for a professional discussion, but you might see aspects of that you can also allocate to this particular criterion. So for 1AA, we're promoting equality of opportunity in the education and care of all children in early years provision, including children with SEND. So as I say, you should be seeing that promotion of equality and anti-discriminatory practice within every aspect of the students' work and interactions with the children. You may or may not be able to see that inclusive of children with SEND. It depends on what's going on in the setting. So that might be something that has to be planned for in a discussion, or that would be naturally occurring as part of a discussion. So careful planning can really help you to think about how you're going to tackle these criteria. And you'll see that when we get down, so I'm just going to whiz right down here to where we have the justifications. Let's find one here. Curriculum and learning. So this is one of the themes here. You'll see that within that category, to help you with planning, or initial planning anyway, as I say, it will become student-centric, then you've got some of those criteria listed for you there. And it will take you down, it will show you what that means, so that can help with planning. What exactly am I trying to plan to meet? What am I looking for? And it will give you an indication of what you're looking for as an assessor, or what you're planning for and what you're discussing at placement as a student. How professional discussion may be planned for and used. And then what competence looks like. And these sorts of things then can be used to support you as an assessor and as a student to understand what the overall outcome is. But also when you are writing your final justifications, you can use some of the things from that competence section and of course relate back to the observation, making sure that in your narrative, you are also, in your narrative observation, you're also making those clear links to the criteria. And that's how this paperwork will work for you in terms of expectation for NCFE. We don't expect written observations to be typed. They've got to be legible, obviously, but we don't expect them to be typed. This is something that we know and appreciate and acknowledge are working documents. So please don't think that we're expecting things to be word processed. Okay, let's take us back to the PowerPoint, and this just gives a little summary of that. So we're planning with the student. This shows you that sort of cyclic process. We're planning with the student. The student may well be able to discuss that plan with their placement mentor. It may be appropriate, depending on the criteria chosen. If it's an experience, a structured activity, it may be appropriate to have a look at an activity plan. If it's more about a routine or a policy, procedure, and so on, that there may be only certain sections of that activity plan that are relevant, and that's okay. Use the activity plan as appropriate. You'll then, as an assessor, carry out that narrative observation. You will hold a professional discussion, being mindful of confidentiality with that professional discussion and how you're going to create that. You're going to give that feedback, feeding forward for next steps and that justification, and you're going to build on that assessment justification to be able to do that and therefore avoid any duplication. It's absolutely fine to be scanning things in and uploading things to an e-portfolio, equally acceptable to be building a file or folder type portfolio with your students. There is no preference here, whatever works for you. And on this link, you'll be able to take a look at assignment 2 part 2 and the 3 structured observations where criteria is set by NCFE. And unlike, in contrast to assignment 2 part 1, these criteria need to be met either through observation or professional discussion in sort of discreetly. So structured observation 1, observation followed by professional discussion, observation 2, and so on. And therefore, and that's when the standardization and the scoring of those structured observations comes into play. There is lots of support available. We have assessor networks that are manned by our moderators, our magnificent moderators, who will be able to support you all the way through this process. You will also have the wonderful support of the provider development, our provider development officer, Gemma McGregor for Education and Early Years, who most of you will have met already, will be able to support you with any queries and questions. And of course, I'm also available. So if you do have any questions, do reach out as appropriate. My name's Janet King. I'm the Sector Manager for Education and Early Years here at NCFE, and I'm on janetking@ncfe.org.uk. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to hearing from you and certainly hearing about your wonderful journeys and celebrations as you go through this process. Good luck.